I wanted to begin by asking you a question. Can you prove that God exists? Not really. Not really. The existence of God can't be proven because I don't think God works that way. God doesn't appear in the world as the conclusion to a mathematical equation. God, as we know through the way of Christ was born, comes into every one of our lives at the end of a gestation process. This is how faith is born in our lives. God doesn't dynamite his way into our lives with a force so powerful that we can't resist. The divine never takes us by storm. It's more like a seed that falls to the earth and dies, and then gradually grows to produce fruit. I believe God always enters our world and our lives in the same way that Jesus did. God is gestated in a womb and appears as a helpless infant that has to be picked up and nurtured and coaxed into adulthood. The presence of God in our world depends upon a certain consent and cooperation on our part. For God to take on real flesh and power in the world, we must first do something. And what is that? Well, I think the answer lies in the very way that Jesus was born. Mary, Jesus' mother, shows us a certain blueprint, a pattern on how God is born into each and every one of our lives, and how faith is born. So what is that pattern? When we look at how Mary gave birth to Jesus, we can see that there are 4 moments in the process. Impregnation by the Holy Spirit, gestation of God within one's body and soul, the stretching and the agony of giving birth, and the nurturing of an infant into adulthood. What's implied in each of these stages? First, impregnation by the Holy Spirit. Mary, we are told, became pregnant by the Holy Spirit. This doesn't just mean that Jesus didn't have a human father, but also that Mary so let the seed of God's Spirit, charity, joy, peace, patience, goodness, long-suffering, fidelity, mildness, faith, and chastity, to take root in her, that it began to grow into actual flesh. Gestation of God within one's body, the second stage. As you know, pregnancy is not followed immediately by childbirth. There's a long, slow process that occurs, and it's the gestation period. And in the silent recesses of her heart and body, an umbilical cord began to grow between Mary and that new life, so that her flesh began to give physical sustenance to the life of God. And this steadily grew into a child which at a point, as in all pregnancies, demanded to be born into the world. The third stage, the agony of giving birth, only with great groaning and stretching of the flesh can a child emerge into this world. It's always excruciatingly painful to birth something to the outside world, to take what's precious inside and give birth outside. And Mary, despite all the over-pious treatises that would make Jesus' birth somewhat unnatural, experienced birth pains common to all mothers. Nothing secretly gestated is born into the world without pain, and Jesus is part of that. And finally, nurturing an infant into adulthood. The great writer Annie Dillard once suggested that we always find God in our lives as Jesus was first found in Bethlehem on Christmas Day. That we find God a helpless infant in the straw who has to be picked up and nurtured into adulthood. God's works are as good as we make them. Mary gave birth to her baby Jesus, but what she ultimately gave the world was an adult Christ. And like all mothers, she had to spend years nursing, cajoling, teaching, and nurturing this infant into his adulthood. In that pattern, the Incarnation, in looking at how Mary gave birth to Christ, we're given a blueprint that invites our imitation and not simply our admiration. Mary is the model of faith. What she did, each one of us is called upon to do, namely, to give birth to Christ in our lives. So we just don't celebrate Christ coming into the world, which took place once and for all. We're talking about imitating how Christ came into the world through Mary, our model. How we can give flesh to this God in this world today. How do you prove to anyone, yourself included, that God exists? You don't. The object of our faith and worship doesn't appear as a compelling proof at the end of a rational experiment. God has to be born into the world in the same way as Mary did all those years ago at that first Christmas. We have to give birth. We have to nurture that Christ within ourselves. We have to bring Christ into the light of day by our words and our actions.